At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and the Sharif of Mecca was given control over the Kingdom of Hejaz. He, however, felt betrayed, refusing ever to sign the Treaty of Versailles, saying he would not affix his name to a document assigning Palestine to the Zionists and Syria to foreigners. But he had threats closer to home, as he clashed with Ibn Saud over control over the Al-Kurma oasis. The Sharif sent his son Abdullah with an army to meet the Saudis, but he was crushed at Turaba. The Saudis were then poised to strike at Hejaz with 10,000 men, and the Sharif was set to lose everything. But the British stepped in and issued an ultimatum to Ibn Saud in July 1919, demanding that he stop his advance. Ibn Saud for now obliged, but later would challenge the Sharif again. To the south there was also a new state. Yahya Muhammad Hamid ad-Din declared his legal independence from the Ottomans when they collapsed, and founded the Kingdom of Yemen without much issue. Nearby, the British finally subdued the Muscat Rebellion, and Timur bin Faisal would continue to rule under their influence until the 1930s. While in the north, the old Ottoman ally Jabal Shammar, led by the Al-Rashid dynasty, was left alone for a while, but they too would soon be conquered by the Saudis. However, most of the focus at the Paris Peace Conference was on the Levant, Iraq, and the Caucasus. The Assyrians, Zionists, Arab nationalists, Armenians, Georgians, Kurds, Azeris, Lebanese, people from the short-lived Tripolitanian Republic, and the mountainous Republic of the Caucasus all attended. On top of that, the Allies all had different demands. And even within these countries, there were all sorts of disagreements. For instance, within England, there was the Anglo-Ottoman Society, which tried to pressure the government to not deprive Turkey of Thrace and Asia Minor, with Constantinople as her capital. Or there was also a movement in India known as Caliphate, which saw many Muslims try to pressure the British to protect the Ottoman Caliph. They also made an alliance with the Indian National Congress and engaged in protest emigration, all moving to Afghanistan. So looking at the potential new countries, let's start with the short-lived Tripolitanian Republic. During the chaos of the First World War, the Senussis had managed to gain ground in Libya, but in 1917, they agreed to make some sort of peace with the Italians. But there was, however, another growing sect, the Ibadis, which Suleiman al-Burani belonged to. He had been exiled years earlier by the Sultan, but was invited back during the war in an attempt to stir up rebellion among his fellow Berbers against the Europeans. And the Turks offered him the hopeful title of Governor of Tripolitania, Tunisia, and Algeria. He would join forces with Ramadan Ashwali and others to declare independence and Izizya. However, they had huge ideological differences, and when Ramadan died in 1920, they began to descend into civil war. To make some sort of peace, the Italians offered Idris, the leader of the Senussi, autonomy in Cyrenaica in 1920, along with a stipend. But the civil war in the new republic continued, and al-Burani was sent into exile. They continued to fight on, even offering Idris control of their state as well. Idris accepted, but the republic quickly fell, and Idris fled into exile in Egypt. Thus he saved himself, but still on paper, he was seen to be the leader of Libya. And he was also fortunate to escape, as shortly after this, Mussolini would come to power and launch a huge pacification campaign in Libya. But in general, North Africa remained the same after the war. Over in the Caucasus though, a whole host of nations appeared. The Ottomans and their allied Islamic army were forced to retreat, allowing the British to occupy most of the major cities like Baku. Here William M. Thompson reported, "The fact is that in Azerbaijan, some Armenians are much disappointed that the British occupation is not an opportunity for revenge. To the north of them there was the Islamic Mountainous Republic, and further north, Denikin and his White Army soldiers were in control. For a while his army seemed poised to succeed, right up until their advance on Moscow collapsed in November 1919. So in this period at least, the British had no initial great worries about the Bolsheviks. The Armenians had also prepared for the Ottoman withdrawal and pushed forward to take their claimed lands. However, they quickly came into contact with the Georgians and their German allies, who claimed Lori. Clashes ensued, and in the end, the Armenians were pushed back. Armenia was also suffering due to the arrival of over 300,000 refugees, and were therefore desperate for new lands. So when the Ottomans finally withdrew from Kars, the Armenians tried to move in. But the Turks helped create a brand new country, known as the Southwestern Caucasian Republic. Ethnic clashes though broke out quickly, and the British were sent in to occupy Kars in April 1919, and a year later it would be given to Armenia. Oliver Wardrope was also appointed Commissioner of the South Caucasus, and he had to draw up new borders. But he included Nakhchivan as part of Armenia. So the Muslims under Jafar Gulu Khan revolted and declared the Republic of Aras to be independent, starting yet another war. The British though would soon pull out of the entire region, encouraging the Azeris and Turks to aid rebels within Armenia itself. The Armenians got some support from Anton Denikin and his White Army, but largely they were left alone, and once again, thousands were massacred. There was also the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh. The British had allowed Khosrow Bey Sultanov from the Azeri side to become governor, but the Armenians within the region launched a rebellion against this decision. Massacres would again take place as the nations fought one another. Like General Andronik led Armenian troops in destroying Muslim villages. Khosrow would then launch his own massacres, especially in places like Shusha. In total, it's estimated during these 2 years after the war, the region lost 20% of its population and hundreds of villages. While all of this was going on though, the Armenians sent a delegation to Paris to take back their historic lands. The mountainous Republic of the Caucasus, headed by Tapa Chomeyev, had also wanted to be recognized. And a new Islamic nation also appeared, known as the North Caucasian Emirate, theoretically under the protection of the Ottoman Sultan. However, all of this would soon become redundant, as the Bolsheviks moved south all the way into Azerbaijan in late April. The next month, Armenian communists tried to rise up to turn their country into a Soviet republic as well, and soon Turkey and Russia would unite to take over both Georgia and Armenia. But the Turks were having their own problems. The Allies occupied Istanbul and most of the country after the war. They also tried to bring those responsible of war crimes to trial, including Halil Kut, who had fought the British in Mesopotamia and took part in the Armenian genocide. However, many of the top leaders like Enver Pasha had fled, and those who were exiled to Malta were freed without punishment. This was largely because many of the documents were destroyed, and with no real legal precedents, the trials were a disaster. Meanwhile, the Italians were determined to gain land promised to them and move troops into Antalya. The Greeks also got support from Britain to occupy Izmir, then known as Smyrna, a couple months later. They had claimed that they were defending Christians, but Venizelos was more concerned with claiming this land before the Italians did. And they also pushed into lands in eastern Thrace, near Istanbul. The Italian foreign minister, Tommaso Tettoni, then met with the Greeks, and they agreed to divide their zones of influence at the Meander River. As part of this, the Greeks also agreed to support an Italian invasion of Albania in exchange for northern Epirus. However, when Carlo Sforza took control of foreign affairs in Italy, he renounced the treaty after revolutionaries in Albania chased the Italians out during the Vlora War. So this whole region was not really agreed upon. But the arrival of Europeans prompted thousands of Turks to join new groups like the Karakol Society, which wanted to assassinate the Sultan and oust the foreigners. While over in Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk, came to prominence. He met with other military leaders, including former Navy Minister Rauf Bey, and signed the Amasya Agreement. This claimed the Istanbul government is unable to carry out its responsibilities. It is only through the nation's effort and determination that national independence will be won. These leaders would go on to have further meetings in Sivas and Erzurum, drumming up support. However, one British diplomat known as Richard Webb said, "Up to the time of the Smyrna landing, we were getting on quite well. But now things are quite changed. Greeks and Turks are killing one another wholesale in the Aydin Vilayet. Mustafa Kemal is busy round Samsun and, so far, refuses to come to heel." The Allies in Istanbul were also growing more concerned about the nationalist movement. So in March 1920, they launched raids on their headquarters and drove them from the capital. Ataturk therefore decided to create a new nationalist parliament the next month in Ankara. This was backed up by a brand new army, which was supported by volunteers from the Caucasus who formed the Green Army Society, led by Cherkes Ethem. As he wrote, "As Circassians we fought in the name of God bravely against the Russians, and in the service of the Caliph we fought in the Balkans. Now the lands of Islam depend on us again." But on the other side was the Sultan's forces of order, or the Caliphate army. This also had Circassian leaders, like Anzavur Ahmed Pasha, who believed Ataturk was blasphemous for working against the Sultan. These two sides clashed at Izmit, but neither side could make a breakthrough. So the British turned more to aiding the Greeks, hoping they could defeat the nationalists. They had managed to occupy Izmir relatively unopposed, as it's estimated around half of the population was Greek anyway, while the rest has been disputed, but it was largely divided between Jews, Armenians and Turks. Now though, the Greeks began rounding up Turkish civilians, shooting many and throwing some into the sea. They then fought their way into towns like Aydin and, usually, proceeded to loot and destroy Turkish homes. Then, in the summer of 1920, they went on the offensive again and captured Usak. The Turks, though, were also at risk of losing land in the east. Sharif Pasha and his Kurdish groups attended the conference in Paris and pushed for independence. However, nobody could really agree on what a Kurdish state would look like and which lands could be included. And this issue, along with Kurdish rebellions, would spread across the border into Iraq, but I'll get onto them later. For now though, in the Caucasus and Turkey, the war hadn't really ended, and everything was set to change with the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres in August 1920. But first, in the Levant, this entire region was placed under the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration, and again, no one really knew what to do. Although many say that the Sykes-Picot Agreement changed the Middle East, at this early point in time, it wasn't even recognized, and almost as soon as the war was over, the Allies began to try to undermine each other. For starters, the Sharif's son, Faisal, had led armies into the Levant, and was set to take over a huge state, including Jerusalem, Jordan, Lebanon and the likes. He largely put this new state in the sphere of Britain, hoping it would counter French designs on Syria during the negotiations. And to some extent he also accepted the Balfour Declaration, saying Turkish intrigue in Palestine has raised jealousy between the Jewish colonists and the local peasants. But the mutual understanding of the aims of the Arabs and Jews will at once clear away the last trace of this former bitterness. This was all part of an agreement he signed with Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement. However, 10 years later, Faisal denied ever signing such an agreement, and some say it could have been Lawrence who created the document. Arab nationalists then met at the Great Syrian Congress of June 1919. Interestingly, Faisal's government and the Congress was filled with future Arab leaders, like Nouri al-Said and Yashin al-Hashimi of Iraq, Jamil al-Ushi of Syria, and Ali Rakabi of Jordan. They declared there should be no separation of the southern part of Syria known as Palestine, nor of the littoral western zone which includes Lebanon from the Syrian country, and later they called for full independence and rejection of Zionism, contradicting Faisal. There was also another congress meeting in Damascus made up solely of Iraqis. They elected Faisal's brother Abdullah as their new king. However, the British pressured him to reject this, which he was obliged to do as he was still dependent on them, and the British were still divided on what to do with the country. Some, like Gertrude Bell, initially believed that the Iraqis would reject such a candidate, and others like DJ Hogarth and the Arab Bureau determined that Abdullah was indolent, pleasure-loving and vicious. Edward Montagu, though, thought that Abdullah could easily be manipulated, and would allow the Raj to take full control. But for now, even though he was Faisal's older brother and had grand ambitions, he had to reject the crown. The Syrian Congress in Damascus also had another purpose. At that time, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points argued that nationalities had the right to self-determination, and the King Crane Commission travelled throughout the region to determine which groups lived there and how they should be divided. They found that only 1% of Palestinians wanted independence, while over 80% of them saw themselves as Syrians and wanted to unite with Syria under Faisal. And of course, around 72% opposed Zionism. If necessary, most in Syria supported an American mandate, while in Lebanon they sided with the French. Over 80% of the Syrians and Jordanians, however, had a negative view of the French, far higher than the British, who, only 15% in the whole region, viewed negatively. This makes some degree of sense, as the French had long been tied to the Christians of Lebanon, and some of these Christians were fearful of being ruled over by a united Muslim state. So around 40% of the Lebanese said that they'd like to see an independent Greater Lebanon, while roughly the same number wanted to become part of Syria. The French had actually already landed troops in Latakia at the end of the war, and they had tried to maintain peace in a region that was usually divided. But they had dismissed the largely Sunni governors of Latakia, and they formed an alliance with the Alawite militias out in the countryside. These Alawites, however, had already been engaged in tribal conflicts against the Shia Ismailis. So, in turn, the Shia formed an alliance with the Maronites. The Alawite leader, Saleh al-Ali then declared his allegiance to Faisal and launched a rebellion against the French. He actually managed to defeat the French and their Christian and Shia allies and took over most of Jabal Ansariya. His successes also prompted a Kurdish man known as Ibrahim Hananu to lead a revolt in Aleppo. This city and the surrounding countryside were far more ethnically diverse than in Damascus, and had a large Kurdish, Turkish and Circassian population, so they were not as supportive of the Arab revolt. But Ibrahim Hananu, despite his Kurdish origins, was a founding member of the Arab Club, and he began attacking the French. They received support from Ataturk, who was determined to push the French out of Cilicia, which both the Turks and the French claimed. The French claims to this region date back to 1915, when papers like the Bulletin of the French Asia Committee called for buffer lands around Syria and the exploitation of its cotton and rice. Plus, they could always challenge the British in Egypt and Cyprus with large ports like Mersin, which could also help them recover from the Great War. In Paris, there was also more of an anti-Turkish sentiment. Like Clemenceau declared, massacre is a chronic ailment in Turkey, so reducing the Ottomans to a rump state was far more of a French ambition on paper. But only 20,000 men were sent to occupy the entire region, and many of these men had served in North Africa and would continue to try to rule with an almost paternalistic attitude, or with contempt for the locals. They often launched punitive raids against villages, or armed Armenians to do the same. Then, in Marash, it is said that the Algerians and Armenians often attacked the locals. In one infamous example, an Armenian removed the veil from a couple of Muslim women. Ataturk then moved a small band of troops south, numbering less than 3,000 with antiquated weapons, while the countryside was filling up with partisans. Then, in early 1920, the people in the city rose up and chased the French out. Although the French were able to fight their way back into the city, they were told to retreat. This was a particularly poor decision, as the now defeated Turks were open to seeking a ceasefire. But the mystery of who ordered the retreat and why still remains. When the Turks took over the city, the Armenians were once again targeted, and this success encouraged Turks to rise up in Urfa, where the small French garrison surrendered in exchange for safe passage. But the Turks' Kurdish allies surrounded and massacred the French regardless. The French tried to bolster their position and laid siege to Gaziantep until 1921, while in Adana, the French and Armenians began to commit atrocities against the Turks, forcing thousands of them to flee in July 1920 in an event known as the Kach Incident. During this, French planes bombed refugees, killing hundreds. But all of this just drove more to join the nationalists, while the French leader Millerand was ruling over a nation that largely wanted peace, or just believed making peace with the Turks would bring peace to Syria. The French, after all, were far more determined to maintain their claims over Syria, as even in late 1918, Clemenceau informally withdrew claims over Mosul and acknowledged British control in Palestine, hoping to guarantee British support for their rule in Syria. Yet the situation for them continued to grow worse, as the Druze under Sultan al-Atrash also declared for Faisal and joined in the revolts. Internationally, in April 1920, the San Remo Conference sort of settled the issue. There, the British, Italians and French divided the region into different mandates. In essence, this was supposed to be temporary rule until the people were ready for independence themselves. But in reality, this was a new concept, and could mean anything from full rule to influence over a nation. With this, Faisal's hope for British support ended, and he was forced to accept the French mandate, initially in exchange for the withdrawal of French troops. To make matters even worse for Faisal, throughout the peace conference in Paris, Patriarch Hoyek of the Maronites had been promoting the idea of an independent Greater Lebanon, where just over half of the population were Christian. But the famine that occurred during the war also led the Patriarch to ask for more land, agricultural land, to prevent such a thing from happening again. But this decision brought even more Muslims into Lebanon. General Gouraud would then declare Greater Lebanon's independence in 1920, while Faisal's advisors told him to reject the French mandate. So Gouraud issued an ultimatum to Faisal, ordering him to disband his armies. Faisal agreed, but people rioted in the streets, and the war minister, Yusuf al-Azma, refused to stand down. Then another ultimatum was issued, convincing the Syrians that the French were determined to invade regardless. In the north, the French had already reinforced their position and recaptured Aleppo without a fight, while the next day outside Damascus, Al-Azma rode out with an army to try to fight the French back. At the Battle of May Salun, a couple thousand Syrians, some fighting with swords, were crushed by an army of 12,000 French with armoured cars and planes. Damascus then fell, and Faisal fled to British lands. Gouraud allegedly went straight to the tomb of Saladin and said, "Awake, Saladin, we have returned. My presence here consecrates the victory of the cross over the crescent." Sheikh Salah and Ibrahim Hananu then united to request their independence be recognised, but Gouraud had managed to largely crush those rebellions by 1921. Some tried to continue their resistance, like Adam Khanjar, a Shia who tried to assassinate Gouraud. When this failed, he fled to the house of Sultan Al-Atrash and continued raiding until he was captured. Al-Atrash would then attack a French convoy in July 1922, but when this failed, he fled to Transjordan to continue the fight. So the French had crushed the Arab state, but this left Jordan unclaimed. The British had supported Faisal's claim to it, yet now the Zionists also wanted it. And the lands around Man were also disputed, as the Sharif of Mecca claimed them as part of Hejaz. One British official that was particularly keen on the expansion of Palestine was Herbert Samuel, a Zionist and now the High Commissioner of Palestine. The Morning Post, however, reported his appointment as High Commissioner was regarded by everyone except Jews as a serious mistake. Many saw it as a clear move towards the creation of a Jewish state, and despite migration quotas, there was another huge wave of Jewish migrants known as the Third Aliyah. Some of these new arrivals had been part of the Herhalutz movement, where they trained in skills needed to create a self-sufficient community. All of this allowed the number of Jews to rise to 90,000, which were defended by the new Haganah paramilitaries. Yet this is still in comparison to the nearly 600,000 Arabs. These two groups clashed very early on, like during the Syrian revolt, when Arabs asked to search the town of Tel Hai for French soldiers. The Jews agreed, but misunderstandings led to a firefight and the death of a Jewish hero of war known as Joseph Trumpeldor. In Jerusalem, the Palestinians also began to organize protests, led by the likes of Amin al-Husseini. His family had long held important positions within Jerusalem, and during the war, he raised a small army to fight for the British. But he supported unification with Syria and attended many conferences held at this time alongside many Christians. Like in 1919, where they declared, "We consider Palestine nothing but part of Arab Syria, and it has never been separated from it at any stage." They argued against Zionism, saying that the British broke their agreement with the Sharif of Mecca, and following the logic of Zionism, Arabs should claim Spain since once upon a time they conquered it and there developed a high civilization, and that the British had, under the financial stress of war, had sold their country to the Zionists. The Zionist leadership meanwhile began to argue early on that a pogrom was imminent, especially in March 1920, when Faisal had been crowned king of Syria and protests broke out in Palestine. The next month, the Nebi Musa festival saw thousands of Muslims take to the streets for a religious procession. In the past, the Ottomans would deploy a huge army to keep the peace, but the British just put out a small police force. What happened next has been disputed, but in the end, crowds began to sack the Jewish quarter, shouting, "Muhammad's religion was born with the sword." The British army managed to restore some sort of order, while the Palin Commission then declared both sides were at fault. This included some Zionists, like Ze'ev Jabotinsky, whose impatience to achieve their ultimate goal and indiscretion are largely responsible for this unhappy state of feeling. This accusation led many Zionists to believe that the British were also complicit in the attack. But really, the British were at this point still remarkably divided. Some high-ranking British were anti-Semitic, and some, like Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, were both anti-Semitic and a Zionist. He accused Colonel Waters Taylor of meeting with al-Husseini to attack the Jews. Allegedly, he said to Husseini, "If disturbances of sufficient violence occurred in Jerusalem at Easter, both General Bowles and General Allenby would advocate the abandonment of the Jewish home." However, Meinertzhagen was a known liar, and his diary claims that he saved the Grand Duchess Tatiana of Russia, and he could have killed Hitler before the war. But he is right in saying Waters Taylor was an anti-Semite, as he published a book detailing the paramount ascendancy of the Jew in England today. The British at this point also did try to stop the Jews from forming their own militias. Their soldiers withdrew from the area for a little while when violence began, and al-Husseini and other leaders were pardoned, while Jabotinsky, on the other hand, was sentenced to years in prison. So Jabotinsky would say, "The Palestine authorities are acting in a manner which clearly tells the Arabs that the Balfour Declaration need not be fulfilled." The British would actually see him and many Zionists as having too many close ties to the Bolsheviks, and therefore more of a threat to their rule. Jabotinsky would later begin to look to Mussolini for an alliance later on. Back in London though, Churchill believed that Jews would bring prosperity to the region, turning it into a land flowing with milk and honey, in which sufferers of all races and religions will find a rest from their sufferings. So, once again, the whole idea was still open for debate. The British were also having problems over in Iraq. Here, the British Raj had taken temporary control, but towards the end of the war, they had faced rebellions in Najaf. Plus, their agreements with France put them in full control of Mosul, and therefore a large Kurdish and Assyrian population. The Assyrians had already been promised a state by the Russians, and it's here where Freydun Aturaya wrote a manifesto, hoping for a Marxist Assyrian state. But Russia dropped out of the war, and in the ensuing genocides, their homeland had been completely transformed. Aga Petros continued to lobby for independence, while William Enger Wigram published a book called Our Smartest Ally. In it he said, "Can Great Britain, now that she is responsible for the order in the country, afford to neglect so valuable a military asset as this nation has proved itself to be?" But despite their wishes, nothing came of this. The Kurds also, although historically divided, had a growing sense of nationalism. The British appointed a Sufi sheikh known as Mahmoud Barzanji to rule over Duhok, and ideally rule over the entire region. This would allow Kurdish lands to remain under British influence and free them up from any real obligations. Barzanji, however, rallied together the tribes and declared independence in May 1919. The British quickly subdued this rebellion and exiled him, but he would soon return. So once again, the debate over northern Iraq was more or less left open for future discussions. And nobody even really knew what to do with the south either. Britain had been awarded the mandate, but there were still discussions over what this really meant. However, in 1919, Jafar Abu al-Tamam formed the Guardians of Independence Party. He declared they should unite the ranks of the Iraqis in their various communities and sects, and to invest whatever efforts possible in putting an end to all divisive factors in religion and belief. In June 1920, the British tried to arrest one tribal leader called Shalan Abu al-Jun. They did this because he allegedly didn't pay back any debts, but in reality he ruled over the Zawalim tribe and was a member of the new nationalist movement. His tribesmen though quickly broke him out of prison, and the whole incident sparked a huge rebellion across Iraq. The nature of this revolt has been disputed. Abbas Qadim, for instance, argued that it was a fiercely Shia-dominated revolt. Abd al-Razak al-Hassani said that the different sects put aside their differences to fight for a united nationalism, while Hannah Batatu calls it a sheikh's revolt against British reforms and policies, rather than a nationalist uprising. One of the leaders of the revolt, though, Mushin Abu Tabik, would later call it a sacred revolution, and its highest goal was to give birth to an Iraqi state. He also said, "I raised with my own hands the first Iraqi flag on the building of the city hall." But this raises even more issues, as we don't know which flag it was. Maybe it was a flag bearing the Arab colours, but these colours were chosen by the family of the Sharif of Mecca, or the Hashemites, and they were largely Sunni. Maybe it was a completely new flag to represent Iraq. But we do know that the rebels flew the Ottoman flag when they took over Kanakin. It seems that a lot of the Iraqi nationalism was just entered into his memoirs decades later. So maybe no one was truly fighting for a nation that was essentially only a few months old. But all of that is still open for debate. And I should say that there were both Sunni and Shia representatives that petitioned for independence, while Ayatollah al-Shirazi in Persia issued a fatwa saying, "It is the duty of the Iraqis to demand their rights, but if the English prevent them from obtaining their rights, it is permitted to make use of defensive force." The rebellion spread to towns like Najaf, Karbala, Samarra and Fallujah, and could have threatened British rule. However, the British still had local allies, so Baghdad and Basra never fell. The rebels also began to alienate many by looting and dividing themselves once again along tribal lines. British reinforcements, alongside their Assyrian allies in particular, began to drive the rebels back. Many villages which refused to surrender were subject to aerial bombardment, but this was a costly affair. It was in fact so costly that the British wanted to step away and install a puppet ruler in their place. As Churchill said, it was an immense expense for military establishments and development work far exceeding any possibility of return. And of Palestine he said, "The Palestine venture is the most difficult to withdraw from, and the one which will certainly never yield any profit of a material kind." But keeping on Churchill, there has been the accusation that Churchill used deadly gas on the Iraqis to quell the rebels. Noam Chomsky and others often quote Churchill when he said, "I am strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes." But they often ignore the passage beforehand. It is sheer affectation to lacerate a man with the poisonous fragment of a bursting shell, and to boggle at making his eyes water by means of lacrimatory gas. So, although he is clearly racist, he is here talking about tear gas, and there's no indication that chemical weapons were used. But to explain the situation so far, nobody ruled in Jordan or Iraq, and the British wanted to step away. The British then believed that the solution for the entire Middle East was the Sharifian solution, or in other words, they'd take the children of the Sharif of Mecca and place them on different thrones. Lawrence of Arabia had proposed this earlier on, but he drew very strange borders. Like one son, Zayd, would take over a small, mainly desert Arab state in eastern Syria. Armenia would be given a lot of land, and Palestine would again be left open. But in the middle, the map just sort of fades out when it comes to Kurdish and Assyrian lands. However, as the French had kicked Faisal out of Syria, this was no longer possible. However, I'll come back to the Sharifian solution later on, as in August 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres was signed. Many show this treaty as partitioning up Turkey, but this isn't exactly true. The Ottomans had to accept foreign control over their national budget in order to pay back their huge international loans. They had restrictions placed on their armed forces, and those guilty of genocide were supposed to be handed over. However, this last one never really happened. But in terms of land, France would get a little of southern Turkey, and the Greeks were given eastern Thrace. In Izmir, though, they would need to hold a plebiscite, and all Kurdish lands were supposed to hold referendums. There was also an international zone around the Straits, but this wasn't set to break free from Turkey, rather just be open to all nations. There were no great calls for partitioning up the rest of Turkey at Sèvres. In fact, it even said, the French and Italian governments will withdraw their troops from the respective areas where their special interests are recognised. So most of the maps showing the partition of the empire come from the tripartite agreement, which developed zones of interest. Yet, in the words of this agreement, being anxious to help Turkey to develop her resources and to avoid international rivalries which have obstructed these objects in the past, in the event of the Turkish government, or the government in Turkestan, being desirous of obtaining external assistance in the local administration or police of the areas in which the special interests of France and Italy are respectively recognised. Or, in other words, if the Turkish or Kurdish governments wanted help in a certain region, these regions would be divided between the Italians or the French. Maybe it could be argued that this would start the eventual annexation, but that would just be speculation. But given that they all agreed to withdraw their troops and the Italians would even aid Ataturk's army, it's hard to believe that this was a stated goal at this point. Maybe it was in 1915 or 16, but not by 1920, with the exception of French Silesia. So this could more likely be compared to what was actually prevalent before the war, when the Germans gained concessions around the Baghdad Railroad and the French kept to Lebanon and Syria. One nation that was set to gain land, though, was Armenia. Here, the Americans were given a mandate to help guide the country to stability, yet when Wilson brought the idea to Congress, the idea was defeated and Armenia was left alone. The Turks had already been looking to expand into Armenia for months, and Lenin even began supporting Ataturk to, in his words, fight against imperialist governments. Ironically though, they would both coordinate invasions of other countries themselves. In September, realizing their opportunity that Armenia had been left alone, the Turks attacked and moved on to Kars. The Bolsheviks, meanwhile, held the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku, and there they decided that they should work alongside the Turkish nationalists to spread communism in the region. The Red Army then moved into Yerevan relatively unopposed, and Armenia became a Soviet republic. Following this, the Bolsheviks would move into Georgia in early 1921, and the new borders were established. The Armenians, however, did manage to get some degree of revenge through Operation Nemesis. Revolutionary groups successfully assassinated many high-ranking people, including Talat Pasha in Berlin and Jamal Pasha in Tbilisi. Enver Pasha, however, escaped and began working with Turkic rebels in Central Asia against the Soviets. However, there was still the issue of Greek troops in the west, and they launched another offensive deep into Anatolia to force the Turks to finally accept the treaty. The Turks, however, just fell back, never meeting them in battle early on. Greece was then thrown into a political crisis, when King Alexander was killed by a monkey bite. The Greek population, now tired of war, joined together to oppose Venizelos and the continuation of the war in the next election. They even voted to bring back King Constantine, the deposed pro-German monarch. The ensuing political factionalism seeped into the army's higher command. They were, however, still better equipped than the Turks, and in early 1921 tried to continue on, but were stopped at Inonu. By this point, many of the allies were beginning to look to make peace and renegotiate the Treaty of Sèvres, so they held a conference in London, with representatives from Istanbul and even Ankara. The Turks were incredibly fortunate again, as many of the allies seemingly did everything they could to undermine one another. For instance, Britain supported the Sultan, but the Italians were providing oil and weapons to the nationalists. Why they supported Ataturk is hard to pin down, as they initially wanted a colony in Turkey, but their generals were told to avoid confrontation at all costs. Maybe they just watched the French defeats in Cilicia and didn't want to get involved. Maybe they knew a large war would cripple their bankrupt nation. Maybe they wished to turn the nationalists into a future part of their sphere of influence, or maybe they just wanted to spite their allies. It's quite hard to tell. The French in Cilicia were also in a weak position with limited men. Franklin Bouillon tried to demand concessions in exchange for withdrawal, but in the end, unwilling to pay for further occupation, the French just pulled out as well. After the following treaty with the French, the Treaty of Ankara, Ataturk said, "The fact that one of the most powerful states that had signed the Treaty of Sèvres, i.e. France, had come to a separate understanding with us, proved to the whole world that the treaty was merely a rag." However, some, including French historian Marcel Homais, asserts that the Treaty of Ankara was primarily to embarrass the British, as the French could now position themselves as champions of Turkish nationalism to challenge the British and their Arab nationalists who continue to threaten their position in Syria. Brits like Lord Curzon saw the whole thing as treachery, many Syrians were angry that their claimed land was being signed away, and French right-wingers saw it as a capitulation. However, in general, most of the French public were apathetic. Regardless of all of this, the Greeks continued on. They won at Kütahya Eskişehir, forcing the Turks to withdraw again to the Sakarya River. But their delays in pursuing the Turks allowed Ataturk to regroup. The two sides clashed at Sakarya for a couple of weeks, until the weakened Greeks retreated and a stalemate ensued. We'll leave this, though, the Greco-Turkish war for now, though, and return to the Sharifian solution, beginning with Jordan, the place which was left in a political wilderness. Here, the British sent Herbert Samuel to meet with the leaders of al-Salt in July 1920, and they declared that Jordan would not become part of Palestine. They also promised that they would aid in the creation of local governments. For instance, they gave Rashid ibn Durgam control over Jabal Ajloun. In September that year, at Qais, the locals demanded an Arab prince to take over, to stop the sale of land to Jews, and a national army funded by the British. The capital of Amman was still made up of many Circassians, and one of them, Sayyid al-Mufti, would change the whole situation. In early 1920, he asked the Sharif of Mecca to send one of his sons to take control. Abdullah took up the offer and arrived in Amman with a few hundred men. The British offered no resistance to his movements as he took over Amman. Instead, Churchill brought him to Cairo to discuss the situation once more. Here, he was told to stop his campaigning before ever arriving in French Syria. Then, he would also greatly improve his own chances of personal reconciliation with the French, which might even lead to him being instated as the Emir of Syria in Damascus. The British therefore still supported his family's claims to Syria, but they didn't want a war. Faisal, meanwhile, was in London, discussing the future of Palestine. But the British put forward the argument that only the Vilayet of Syria was promised, not Jerusalem. In early 1921, Lawrence wrote to Churchill saying, Faisal had agreed to abandon all claims of his father to Palestine. In return for this, he was offered the throne of Iraq. But this once again has been disputed. Nevertheless, Faisal journeyed back to the Middle East, and for the first ever time, Iraq, where he was crowned king in August 1921. There were opponents to this plan, like Talib al-Naqib, an old nationalist who wanted power for himself. But a referendum was held, and 96% of voters supported Faisal being appointed king. Yet this number does suggest some sort of foul play, and had the voters been given another contender to the throne, maybe the number would be lower. But the Sharifian solution had put Faisal in power in Iraq, and Abdullah in control of Transjordan. Abdullah in particular would continue trying to unite with Syria for decades, even controversially agreeing to the partition of Palestine in order to claim more land for himself. In Hejaz, though, the Sharif still refused to recognize any peace treaties, believing he had been betrayed. But he wouldn't rule for much longer, as the Saudis would take over Mecca. The British also largely stepped out of Egypt at this time, at least on paper. The country had been under military occupation during the war, with Hussein Kamal I as a puppet ruler. When he died, Fuad I took over, but he was unpopular, and the country suffered during the war. Like over 1 million Egyptians were used in labour corps on the front lines, which some began to call slavery. And Russell Pasha, the British commander in Cairo, was concerned about the drug epidemics in the country. Saad Zaghloul and his Wafd party then led a delegation to Paris, requesting British rule formally end. The British then tried to stop the movement by sending him to Malta, but this just led to riots. All elements of Egyptian society took part, attacking railway lines, homes, and even British soldiers. Zaghloul was released to try and stop the revolutionaries, but he just took control of the movement. Another inquiry was commissioned to determine the cause of the disturbances, and Lord Milner reported that the protectorate status should end. The British even offered Zaghloul the throne, while hoping to keep some sort of oversight in the country. This, however, was rejected, so he was exiled once more, this time to the Seychelles, where he was joined by an exiled Somali leader, Mohammed Ali Shire. Edmund Allenby, the governor of Egypt, continued to put down protesters, in one case executing 16 rioters. But he argued in favour of Egyptian independence, even threatening to resign over the issue. So in early 1922, Fuad became the new king of an independent Egypt. Yet an independent Egypt which was still under British influence, and they shared administration over Sudan. And the end of the war also saw the end of British dominance in Afghanistan. Here, Habibullah Khan had remained loyal to the British and refused to join the Central Powers. However, many in his court believed that this was a betrayal, and some in his own family were far more open to the idea of fighting the British. This included his brother Nasrullah and one of his sons, Amanullah. Then, in early 1919, Habibullah Khan was assassinated in his tent by one of his own pages. Who ordered the assassination, though, is still a mystery. As Habibullah did not name a successor, it was believed that his eldest son, Inayatullah, would succeed him. He, however, refused the throne and supported his uncle, Nasrullah. In Kabul, though, Amanullah quickly staged a coup and arrested Nasrullah, accusing him of assassinating his father. Now in power, Amanullah quickly set about trying to make Afghanistan a fully independent state, and hopefully reclaiming some of their lost territories. He was also pretty fortunate, as the Great Game had reopened, and the Russians were once again looking to expand south. The Soviets met with Amanullah to discuss the possibilities of an alliance as part of the Kalmyk project. And they would also meet with the remnants of the Indian Provisional Government under Mahendra Pratap, which had remained in Kabul. Although no true agreement was reached, Amanullah was still determined that he could strike at a weakened British Empire, especially at this time as Indian calls for independence were growing louder, like in Punjab in particular, where the infamous Amritsar massacre took place in April 1919. Here, Reginald Dyer surrounded protesters and killed maybe 1,500 of them. The British government condemned Dwyer, with Asquith saying it was one of the worst, most dreadful outrages in the whole of our history. So the Afghans crossed the border in May 1919 and captured Bagh. Their army, however, was still in a poor state, and the British, with their local allies, quickly drove them back to the border. The British, however, couldn't proceed far over the mountains though, so they just bombed Afghan positions, resulting in a stalemate. Eventually peace was just made, and Afghanistan was given freedom to conduct their own diplomacy. However, they still depended on British aid, and internationally, the British would force countries to acknowledge their authority in Afghanistan. But in Kabul, Amanullah was seen as a hero and cemented his control. The war, though, had encouraged tribes in Waziristan to rebel, and the British campaigns against them would continue until 1920. Also, the Great Game began to reignite within Persia as well. In the north, Mirza Kuchuk Khan still led the jungle movements. The motives of this group, though, have been debated, as they could have sought independence, maybe a communist state, or were just Persian nationalists. But in May 1920, the Soviets sent ships to Anzali on the Caspian Sea. Initially, they were only there to try and pursue Denikin's forces, but they quickly began to make approaches to Kuchuk. Many there, including Ehsanullah Khan Dustar, the second in command, were already communists, and the Bolsheviks agreed to grant them their autonomy. So in 1920, the jungle movement became the Persian Soviet Republic. Kuchuk, however, didn't implement the more radical communist reforms, like the redistribution of lands. This caused splits within his party, and rather than face a conflict with the communists, he left, and died of frostbite in the mountains. Ehsanullah took over alongside Soviet advisors, and angered most of the population by infringing on their centuries-old property rights. And this is when rumours began to circulate that the Bolsheviks were equipping a small force to move on to Tehran. Meanwhile, the British still had an ally in the south, in Khuzestan, and the Anglo-Persian Agreement was set to place the rest of the country under British influence. The British would take control of all oil fields, training and supplying the Persian army, the construction of railroads, and a lot more. Many, of course, refused to accept this, like Muhammad Kiyabani, a Shia cleric and supporter of the constitutional movement. He revolted and took over Tabriz, creating a state which he called Azadistan, or the Land of Liberty. Yet it only lasted until 1920. The treaty was also denounced by the Iranian parliament and was never fully implemented. The British now, though, hearing the rumours, were far more fearful of Bolshevik expansion. So General Ironside handed a young Persian commander control over a battalion of Cossacks. He was Reza Pahlavi, and was seen as a capable commander, and, in the words of General Ironside, would solve many difficulties and enable us to depart in peace and honour. Or, in other words, he would stop the Bolsheviks from expanding and allow the British to withdraw. Ironside then clarified some of the conditions he set to Reza. Like 1, I told him not to strike us in the back with guns and ammunition we provide him with. Such action will result in his demise. 2, he must promise not to oust the king after his arrival into Tehran. However, Ironside's true role in all of the future events has been disputed. Nevertheless, with just over 3,000 men, Reza Pahlavi marched into Tehran in 1921. As promised, he didn't remove the Shah from power. Instead, he just demanded that Zia al-Din be made prime minister. Together, they quickly signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviets to secure their northern borders. In exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet support for the jungle movement, the Persians promised that neither the White Army nor the British could use Persia as a base to invade Russia. But the new prime minister wouldn't last very long. He quickly made many enemies by declaring, "All the residents of the city of Tehran must keep quiet. All newspapers and prints will be stopped. All shops where wine and spirits are sold, as well as theatres, cinemas and clubs where gambling goes on, must be closed." On top of that, he tried to make huge changes to the nation, angering many religious leaders and landowners. And Persia would be very close to disintegration once again.